Hey, we're all on the screen. That's so good. Okay, so we are at the site of Mycenae. If you looked at that chronological chart that I gave you last time, you will see that the word Mycenae does a lot of work in any discussion about Bronze Age in Greece. The third and second millennia BCE are the Bronze Age of Greece. Mycenae is a place, this place, because this was the first place that artifacts of the period that early archaeologists identified with the Homeric epics. It gave its name to that era. So that era is called Mycenaean. And that means that things can be Mycenaean even if they aren't from Mycenae. So sorry about that. Sad truth. So, and then Mycenaean is an era that is part of a larger era called the Bronze Age. The early Bronze Age is the third millennium BCE. The middle Bronze Age is basically the first half of the second, and the late Bronze Age is basically the second half of the second. Mycenaean is frequently used as the equivalent of the late Bronze Age because it's in the late Bronze Age that all of this glamour stuff, like some of the material that we started to see last time, was discovered by Schliemann. Now, just to be even slightly more complicated, when I say Bronze Age, third and second millennia, 2,000 years, that's for all of the Mediterranean and Near East. But every zone in the Mediterranean and Near East has its own designators as well. There are really good reasons for this, but from your point of view, it just seems completely unnecessarily complicated. And on behalf of archaeologists and their hyper desire to classify, I apologize. Okay, so in Greece, on the mainland of Greece, the Bronze Ages are called the Helladic periods, because Hellas is the Greek word for Greece. So you have early Helladic, EH, middle Helladic, MH, and late Helladic, LH. And if you were on the island of Crete, those ages would be called Minoan. So late Minoan is more or less the equivalent of late Helladic, but it takes place on Crete instead of on the mainland of Greece. Troy is not in Greece, you might have noticed, nor on Crete. In fact, it's on another continent, Asia, in modern-day Turkey. So there, the late Bronze Age is the late Bronze Age. But Troy has its own designators for the cities and the phases that were excavated there. And in those levels and places, there are Roman numerals that go with the different cities. Troy II, which dates to the third millennium, you may recall, about 2500 BCE, is part of the early Bronze Age. Troy II is an early Bronze Age settlement. It's in the third millennium. The dates are the same as the early Bronze Age. Troy VI is partially Middle Bronze Age and partially Late Bronze Age because the dates of it span both of those classifications. And so, when the walls of Troy VI were first constructed, there was no citadel at Mycenae. If you look at that chart that I handed out, you'll see that when Troy VI begins, there's nothing much built up yet at Mycenae. But by the time Troy VI ends, because it lasts for something like 500 years, 1800 to 1300, things have picked up here. But throughout the time that we will be talking about for the rest of today, throughout the time of the ruins and the remains that we'll be seeing from Mycenae today, that development, over those many hundreds of years of that development, Troy VI stood as a big walled city. So it was there throughout the time that Mycenae developed from whatever it was to whatever it became And now we will plunge back into that scenario. So, are there any questions? Do I know when they're going to get more course packets? We'll have to talk about that at the end of the hour. So the Paradigm. Does anybody else not gotten a course packet from Paradigm? Several of you. Can you raise your hands higher so I get a sense of how many? 1, 2, 3, 4. 4. Okay. I'll speak to them. So in 1876, 1876, Heinrich Schliemann launched Mycenaean archaeology by marching through the Lion Gate at Mycenae and coming here to Grave Circle A, readily identifiable by these nice, tall, standing walls, which we now know date later than the shaft graves themselves. That is, the graves were there, and later the walls were built around them, and we will learn on Tuesday about what was going on at Mycenae when the wall around Grave Circle A was built. But anyway, by Schliemann's time, it was all there. It was very easy to spot. It was a great big circle, big graves inside, and he excavated all 6 of the shaft graves and found amazing things, including just in shaft grave 4 alone, an incredible amount of stuff. And the materials that we started looking at last time and we'll finish looking at today all come just from one place, shaft grave 4. And we were coming up with classifications. We were coming up with categories. Why am I interested in categories? This is a rhetorical question. You do not need to answer. I'm going to tell you why I'm interested in categories. Although you should be interested that I'm interested in categories because you need to produce categories of objects if you're going to answer question 2 of the question set. So if you've already decided you're only answering questions 1 and 3, you don't have to listen to this next minute of explanation. What's the point of a category? Because if you've got 400 objects in one shaft grave, as we do from shaft grave 4, you have the option of talking about them in a long, long list, like a telephone book. Then there was this, and then there was that, and then there was another thing, and then there was another thing. And pretty soon, almost immediately, even if the objects are glamorous, your listener is going to be bored and walk away. And by the time you get done listing everything in the list, you're not really going to have said much, except there were a lot of things. If you put them into categories, you can begin to analyze them, compare the finds from this with the finds from something else. Think about them as a phenomenon as opposed to just a bunch of stuff. So thinking about categories helps us take that next step, that one step away from this is what we found to this is what we now think about what we found, which is the heart of archaeology. Did you have a question? No. Okay. So now, categories are not a single-shot deal. Categories are expansive and flexible. How lucky for us. So there are tons of categories. What were some of the categories that these funerary masks could fall into? You in the back of the red shirt. They could be like for someone like famous or rich. They're wealthy objects. Yes. So they are objects that reflect tremendous wealth. Something else. They are gold. In and of themselves, they fall into the category of gold things. Something else.
Necessarily like religious artifacts, but they're form of living records and funeral rites. So funerary artifacts.
They are associated with some sort of funerary observance or perhaps even ritual. Ritual in the very basic sense of a rite, an activity.
They are a mark of important status or family.
They are a mark of importance,
Status or family.
status or family. Why would they be a mark of family? Oh, so because they are individual? Well, so that would make them a mark of each individual. And they are certainly that. They are representative of an individual, and one would reasonably assume, based on the fact that they are gold and they are elaborate, that they are a mark of status. There was somebody down here.
That's what I was
Oh, you were going to say that. Well, that would have been a good thing to say. Yeah.
The male.
They are male. Nice. Thank you.
Question though?
Yeah.
Why does the one in the upper left hand corner have a beard?
Because he had a beard.
And like the other two are brown with that one?
And that is a good observation, which suggests what? Say what? Why would having a beard make him later? Well, you know.
That was more like facial structure. The other ones are very brown.
So the observations that are factual are: one of them has a beard, the faces are round, their noses are different. The key word in the thing that you said before was could. Wasn't any of the nouns. It was the aspect of the verb. Lots of things could be something. What we are interested in are well-supported suppositions. And by well-supported, I mean something supported by the data to hand.
Maybe these masks were customized for these people, as they are all show different individual faces.
Maybe the masks were customized because they all show individual faces. Not just maybe, it's likely. Now, we would like to assume that they are accurate, but we don't actually know that. They could be idealized. You could think possibly about the relationship of your high school yearbook photo with the way you might have actually looked that day. Your hair might not have been quite that fantastic. Your skin might not have been quite that fantastic, but most of us look much nicer in our high school yearbook photos. So there can be cosmetic enhancement. Maybe somebody's face wasn't that wide, their cheekbones weren't that high.
It could be a representation of how old they were when they died.
It could be a representation of how old they were when they died, but not necessarily. Somebody could have been a lot older when they died, and so these could be more ideal. So we don't actually know whether the idea behind the artist here was to make somebody look better or younger or real. But we do know one thing. They looked different from each other. That's the first and most secure conclusion that you can draw from the good observations that you made. A beard on one, but not on the others. Rounder face, more aquiline nose, less, rounder eyes, higher cheekbones, lower cheekbones. They are differentiated. So the idea is to represent them differently, meaning as individuals. Maybe actually how they looked, maybe better, but anyway, unique. No one mask looks just like another. That's the key point. Status and gold and prestige were not relegated only to grown men in the shaft grades, as we know from the two whole body gold suits of the children, and that's what supports the conclusion that you brought up, which is that the aspect of status might extrapolate out to family, not just individuals, because the marks of status were provided not only to grown men, but to children, who in and of themselves were unlikely to have accomplished in their lifetime the things that would have provided that status. So this is the born with it as opposed to acquired it kind of status. And that means that status accrued to family groups. Whoever cell phone that is, turn it off right now. Yes?
In chapter 4, you said there were
In check grade 4, there were 8 women.
and
9 men, 8 women, 2 children.
And
Actually, in chef grade 4, there are 3 women. In all of the chef grades, there are 9 men, 8 women, and 2 children.
But then do the speculated that these children are male, and then the males got the masks, so women.
So the question is, do the women have adornments? We would love to know that so much. Too bad Schliemann didn't take photos or good notes about exactly the way things looked when he opened up the shaft graves. Wouldn't that have been great? Oh, yeah. Oh, no. We have photographs of some of the members of his team wearing some of the jewelry. Not an archaeological practice we pursue any longer. So, good question, don't know the answer. The fact that they're in there, that the women are in the shaft graves, suggests that, like the children, women could have status by relation. Whether you want to go further and speculate that women might have had status on their own, here is what you need to do. Hold on to that question for about 3 weeks, because we are going to get to an extremely cool site, super cool, that may provide you with some evidence about that, which dates a little bit later in the shaft graves. Ooh. Anticipation. Okay, so another one of the categories in the shaft graves, weaponry. We looked at these before. These were 5 daggers. These are among many other items of weaponry. 27 swords, 16 pommels, 38 arrowheads, 16 knives, 5 daggers, an axe, a trident, 2 whetstones for sharpening the things, if they were actually actively used, or maybe it was just, you just never know in the next world. So weaponry, and also another category that the weaponry could fall into was elaborately decorated, and another category that the weaponry, these particular items could fall into was carrying figural representation. In that, these are fall into the same category as the masks, which is figural representation.
Do we know what the blades were made of?
Do we know what the blades were made of? We do, and it's a real complicated process. They are made in a technique called niello, Niello. They're bronze. They're hammered bronze or cast bronze, and then this part where you see the picture is cut out. So the bronze is thick. There's a piece that's cut out. Figures made out of gold and silver and electrum are created, cold hammered, put into place. The interstices between the figures has a sort of soldering agent that's a combination of several sorts of metals. Then the whole thing is put into a furnace so that it melts together and fuses, and then it's taken out and polished. So another category that you could say that the daggers fall into is highly complex technical metalworking. These are little, here magnified many times, very small. They are signet rings. So they're gold rings, so this is more in the category of gold. Also more in the category of figural representation. What is being shown? Now, I know it's being shown, obviously. Here a man is having a sort of knife-to-hand combat, knife-to-paw combat with a lion. And here is a hunt. There's one person in a chariot with a bow hunting a stag. The chariot is being drawn by horses in this wonderful pose that art historians call a flying gallop. Isn't that cute? Because they look like they're flying. And then there's a sort of helper person. There's landscape around. There's a ground line. The ground line sort of turns into a tree. I like that part. That's cute. There's some foliage or I don't know what on the top. Real, ideal. Do they need to be one or the other? Real. Can Can they be both? They could, yeah. But real? Very, very few of you put up your hand. Ideal, some sort of imaginary, and why would that be?
It's more interesting, more fantastic than something real would probably just be some household scene, something that happens every day.
On a gold signet ring that you put in a burial? On a household scene that you see every day?
Well, something that's not as fantastic as, stuff like this, like a guy fighting a lion with a knife. I mean,
I agree, that looks unlikely.
yeah, and the flying gallop and everything, that's kind of exaggerated.
So, for those of you that are willing to see this as real, your argument would be?
Well, the fact that that's how they hunt, and they have the fights against lions, and swords. They do that.
How do we know? What histories would those be? Because we would have absolutely ancient authors who, thinking about the past, assert that people did that. Like in the Iliad, for example. But you will recall our conversation on the very first day of class when we said, how do we know about the past? 3 ways: writing, talking, finding stuff. For those periods where we don't have any texts that are written, and therefore by definition don't have any eyewitness oral accounts, we only have the stuff we find. We are in an era here where we only have archaeology. Anything that's written down that talks about this era, in Greece, you're right that in the Near East we have contemporary texts. But here in the Greek world, we don't. Everything is retrojected back, and for many hundreds of years.
They continue that into the idea
So you need to be careful about your words still. Yes, and in the era of the Roman imperial period, fighters in the arena, say in the Colosseum, were put in there with wild animals. Yes, they were. That is about 1,500 years later. And these folks didn't know about that. So you can only, this is going to sound like an obvious statement and maybe not even an applicable statement, but it's important when you're thinking about how to interpret the remains of the past to think only up to the period you are, but no further. We live forward. We don't live backward. The reason that it's tricky is because we're looking backward now, and we know everything that happened afterwards. So we know about the Colosseum. We know about later writers. But you should not, as a mode of reasoning, say, this happened 1,000 years later, therefore this is what's likely to have happened back then. It's just not a fair way to reason.
My next question is it unlikely that events like fighting lions happened 1,500 years before? Because, for example, where would they get the idea to have an imagination to draw a rampant lion? That's maybe something.
So really, that's the heart of the question, isn't it? If were there, so okay, question number 1, were there lions in Greece in the Bronze Age? The answer is yes, there were. How do we know? Because we've got the faunal remains. Faunal remains means the bones. So yes, there are faunal remains, so we know that lions existed. So people could have seen lions. And from there, you have to say, well, you have 2 choices. One, if you would have never known of an event like this where a man and a lion fought, then you wouldn't be able to imagine it. So this must be real. And the other option is you make up a story, and it attaches itself to an idea of some famous thing that you might have heard that somebody did. And the truth is, we cannot pick between those. The important thing, again, like articulating what's the important thing about the differentiation of funerary masks. The important thing is that a priori, that is from the beginning of looking at these objects, you can't decide. You can't say, okay, I can prove this or I can prove that, one way or the other. Both options need to be open. Why does that matter? Because we also have scenes like this found on a vessel in the shaft graves. This is a fancy kind of drinking cup, a very impractical kind of drinking cup. Very impractical kinds of drinking cups are called rhyta, R-H-Y-T-A. That's if you have a bunch of them. If you have only one, you have a rhyton, R-H-Y-T-O-N. This rhyton is made out of silver. Silver, therefore, would be another category. You can have objects of gold, you can have objects of silver. It also has figural representation. This figural representation shows a battle and a siege. There's a walled city with turrets. The walls are made out of ashlar blocks. You can see the square or the rectangular, neatly formed blocks. Where have we seen ashlar blocks? Troy. What level of Troy? 6. Yay. Yes, Troy 6. On the battlements, you see women with their arms upraised in various positions of either exhortation or alarm. Can't really tell which. And some of them are turning to call to other people back in the city. People are looking at various levels out from the city. There is a landscape of trees. There are ground lines, again, people on different ground lines. There are altogether on this vessel, which is called the Silver Siege Rhyton, because it's a rhyton and it's made of silver, and it seems to be depicting a siege. But that, in and of itself, that last piece is a little bit of a conclusion. But anyway, that's the name of the vessel, Silver Siege Rhyton. On the Silver Siege Rhyton, there are 38 figures, moving and armed. And you can see that there is a collection of them, both with spears and with bows and arrows. And there are chariots. Here's the wheel of a chariot coming along. And they are fighting. There are people who are already wounded. Real or not. It's the same problem as the signet rings. If you say it's real, you might invoke as one of your pieces of evidence, well, we know about stories like this, like the Iliad. That would be a nice case of what we in the business like to call circular reasoning. How do we know that the Iliad might be real? Well, we find objects that seem to be illustrating what was written about in the Iliad. How do we interpret that object? Well, we interpret it because we've got a story like the Iliad. Closed circle. The Iliad, of course, about 500 years later, by the time it's written down. The Silver Siege Rhyton, on the other hand, comes from grave circle A, shaft grave 4, at Mycenae. There were stories about war, just like there were stories about lion hunts. They might have been real stories. And they might have been great imaginary stories. Do you have a question? No? Okay. Other rhyta, other elaborate drinking vessels found in the shaft graves. So elaborate drinking vessels, that would be a category. That would be another category. I know these don't look like drinking vessels. That's why we give them the name rhyta. It doesn't only mean elaborate, it means completely impractical. That's just my definition. That's not the dictionary definition. So this is silver with the gold rosette. It's obviously the head of a bull with gilded horns. The place that you would drink would be out the back end. You wouldn't really drink. It's kind of like those daggers. The daggers are daggers. I mean, you identify them as daggers. A dagger sounds like something practical. A dagger is something practical. Those daggers are almost certainly not practical. This is a drinking vessel. You identify it as a drinking vessel. A drinking vessel sounds like something practical. This, very impractical. So, another category for objects inside the shaft graves would be highly impractical or overly decorated objects. And we have a neater single word for that sort of thing that we tend to use, and that's ceremonial. Ceremonial objects. This is gold. It is a lion, or it's probably actually a lioness, because she doesn't have the mane. Unlike the much more refined workmanship of the daggers with the little scenes on them, this is sheets, flat sheets of gold that are sort of hammered together into place. It's actually quite crude. And the facets and the angles of the gold suggest that there might have been some form that had been made underneath it, and then the gold used as a kind of model or a base to construct this. Maybe something out of wood, because these flat planes of the way that the gold sheets are formed suggest that the form had flat planes. So, two possibilities for the form underneath it are clay and wood. Wood is more likely because it's easier, more normal to carve wood into big flat sheets than clay, which is easier to form into rounded things. So, a lot of gold, but the workmanship of these gold objects is very different from piece to piece. Here's another drinking cup, this time a lot more practical, also Niello in its technique, Niello, in case you did not write it down the first time. And this with little heads. The heads are distinguished one from the other. Different shaped beards. This guy's got a lot more hair. Some of them look to have something on the order of a receding hairline. So there are kind of differentiations, but not so significant that you would call them actual individuals. Drinking vessels that look a lot more practical. Silver and gold, let's see. Altogether in Chef Grade 4, 11 silver vases, 5 gold vases, 22 bronze vases, 8 clay, 2 faience, F-A-I-E-N-C-E. This is all, you can find this in your reading. 2 gold raita, 3 silver raita, that includes the silver siege raita, and, this is my favorite, 2 ostrich egg raita. Raita made out of ostrich egg. Talk about impractical. But impressive.
The cups that were found in the fill above the shaft grave?
Clay. The cups that were found in the fill above the shaft grave, in the couple of meters of dirt that came down on top of the roof, were clay, were terracotta. They were not fancy, elaborate vessels. Good question. Thank you. Alabaster. I like that. Isn't that nice? Alabaster. 3 alabaster vases. Seal stones. These are amber. These are carved seal stones. That is, they came out of the signet ring. But in addition to carved seal stones, there were also 1,290 amber beads. So, artifacts from the shaft graves come from a pretty wide area. Mycenae here in southern Greece. This is the Peloponnese of Greece. And we have seen gold, which comes from the area of Transylvania and the Danube, modern-day Transylvania, the area of the Danube. Silver, which comes from northern Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Ivory from the area of Syria. Lapis lazuli, which I didn't tell you about, but there was lapis lazuli found in the shaft graves, which comes from, likely, the worked lapis lazuli from the shaft graves comes from the area of Mesopotamia. The lapis lazuli itself actually comes from Afghanistan, but the workmanship came from, so probably either the finished object or an itinerant craftsperson from southern Mesopotamia. The ostrich eggs, the two ostrich eggs, Raita, Nubia, modern-day Ethiopia. The alabaster, Egypt. The faience, Crete. The amber from the Baltic. So what's another category for objects in the shaft graves? Trade items. Or, maybe they're trade items. You know what trade implies? Trade implies that you give something to get something, that it's a swap. So minimally we can say that a lot of these objects come from far away, so you could say that they're imports. Now, trade is one way to get objects from far away, and what's another way to get objects from far away? Raids, right. Is it likely that the Mycenaeans were in all of these places? No. I will tell you the answer to that. The answer is no. Because we don't have any evidence for them whatsoever being so far away. But beyond that, we can't say how exactly all these objects arrive. And they don't necessarily all arrive on individual routes to Mycenae. That is, objects with more elaborate workmanship might be filtered through areas where there are cultures and civilizations that are already producing and crafting objects like that, such as Crete. And so the Mycenaeans would be getting these objects from Crete, where, so for example, the fancy daggers, the yellow daggers with their extremely elaborate workmanship, both the workmanship, that specific workmanship, and the style of the daggers almost certainly come from here, whereas that wacky gold lion Raiton with the big faceted gold plates, that is not the same workmanship as this. So even though both of them are very elaborate objects, they likely come not only from two different routes, but from two different mechanisms from those routes. And details about all of this and more speculation and information are available in your reading on the shaft graves. And if you don't want to, and if you prefer to read it online, you can get to it by going to the course website and going to site and subject links, and going to Aegean Bronze Age and picking the shaft graves lesson. Yes.
So why is nothing from Mycenae itself that people over there?
Why is nothing from Mycenae itself? There are things from Mycenae itself, like all the clay vases are from Mycenae itself. But most of the objects inside the shaft graves are either the materials or the materials and the workmanship are from someplace else. Most of the objects in the shaft graves. Grave Circle A was an astonishing find. Nobody was prepared for it. Not Schliemann, not anybody. Nobody knew what to make of it. If you wouldn't have found it buried down in the ground, people would have thought that it was some scam that somebody had made up, that it was modern. And for about 80 years, it was unique in every way. And then, in 1951, Greek archaeologists working on the outskirts of the citadel of Mycenae discovered a second grave circle. So here is grave circle A. And here, outside the Lion Gate, there's the Lion Gate, just partially along partially covering, actually, the road, the approach road to Mycenae is a second grave circle. Because it was the second grave circle found, it's called grave circle B. but it predates grave circle A. It's earlier. Grave circle B had 14 shaft graves. None were as large or as wealthy as any in grave circle A. The largest and wealthiest of the graves in shaft graves in grave circle B is grave Gamma, which you're looking at here. And because it was excavated by a very good archaeologist, George Milanas, in 1951, we can see what he actually found when he opened up the graves, as opposed to grave circle A and the shaft graves from Mycenae. And we can see that in grave Gamma, there were 4 people buried, 3 men, 1 woman. There was, like in the grave circle A, an upper filling. The upper filling had 40 broken vases in it. And then there was the log and thatch roof. And then beneath that roof, there were the remains. When it was found, one of the burials was intact in the sense that the bones were still organized properly. All the rest, the bones had been, and the goods with them had been pushed to one side. Evidence of the event that occurred last, when space was made by just pushing all of the remains to one side, space was made for the final burial. You have to imagine that as each subsequent burial was put in, what was there was just moved aside to make room. The final burial is of a man about 6 foot tall. He had a funerary mask, and he had a sword with an ivory pommel.
How much did you say these predate?
How much did I say these predate? Well, you can see the dates. So grave Gamma is 1600 BCE. So you should pay attention to the dates. That's what. There were in grave Gamma 2 funerary masks, a rock crystal sort of sauce boat, just gorgeous. The rock crystal and the style, the material and the style are both Egyptian. A small signet ring, here's something closer to its actual size, and here it is blown up so that you can see it, with a distinctive profile, bearded, aquiline nose, pretty similar, actually, in profile to the gold funerary mask that Schliemann called the Mask of Agamemnon. Two gold vases and 14 bronze swords, daggers, spearheads, and knives, clay vases, and some more of those gold discs that were certainly stitched to a shroud or clothing. Did I tell you that there were 14 shafts? Yes. 14 shafts in Grave Circle B. In those 14 shafts, 24 people were buried. But those 14 shafts were not the only burials. There were 10 other burials of a sort that we call cyst graves, C-I-S-T. Grave Eta, that's a Greek Eta, not an American English H. Grave Eta, all the graves have Greek letter names because they were excavated by Greek archaeologists. Grave Eta is a cyst grave, and as you can see, it's about a half century, about 50 years earlier in date. You see that unlike a shaft grave, a cyst grave is relatively shallow. Shaft grave is quite deep, 2 to 3 meters. A cyst grave is half a meter to a meter. Instead of having multiple people inside the grave, there's only one. They are single burials. They are still inhumations, not cremations. The burials are still the body hasn't been burned up. There are grave gifts or goods, but they are few and they are poor. Such as these clay vessels. Yes?
How many cis graves did you say there were?
10 cis graves. How is it that we get these dates? We get the dates by the style of the pottery. This style of pottery, which we know from other Middle Helladic sites, Grave Circle B dates to Middle Helladic 3 to Late Helladic 1. So about just before the middle, down to the middle of the second millennium. At other sites, we have vessels of this shape. These are the vessels from, these are the vessels from grave Eta. These are the vessels from grave Gamma. And it's easy to see that the only real difference between them is material. Same shape. So wherever that workman who crafted these gold vessels came from, the shape of the vessels that he was asked to make were the shape that was already the standard sort of drinking vessel shapes. As if he had these models, but much, much better material. We'd like to know a lot more about Mycenae in the middle of the second millennium. It's amazing that we can have discoveries of this quantity and this quality and not know, for example, where these people lived. But we don't have any housing, good or bad, big or small, of this date from this site. We just have grave circles B and A. Now, it's obvious that over the 200 years or so from the Middle Helladic 3 cyst graves to the shaft graves here, to the shaft graves here, that something happened. What do you think are the possibilities for what happened in Mycenaean society from Middle Helladic 3, that is the earliest of the cyst graves here, to Late Helladic 1, meaning the later shaft graves in Grave Circle A? You get 3 minutes to talk to somebody next to you. Go. Come up with as many explanations and ideas as possible. So the line was always walk right through it, and the surface was visible. You know, and so what she had to do was just go inside and mark that circle and say, let's be here. This must be as well places right into the gate. There's this big circle. The stones, let's be here.
No.
You guys just
You probably know.
we don't have any other grade circle A is about 1600. B is about 1650. Now remember the rules. These are the ground rules. You can't really be wrong, but whatever you say, you have to support it. You have to support it, and you don't want to take more than one step away from the actual data. So whenever you say something, you have to say, and I think this because ... meaning because of this sort of find, this sort of object, this sort of discovery. Okay, what do you think?
I think there was status to the society because there's one chef group and there's like a whole bunch of stuff and then there's this further whole thing with the environment.
So one of the changes is that the concept of status infiltrates this society. Is it there at the beginning? Is it there at the beginning? Does grave eta, cyst grave eta, suggest status?
Maybe consider
Maybe, but the time difference is something. The other one is the later one. This one is previous to that one.
Grave eta is one of the earliest of the graves in Grave Circle B. It's the single inhumation with a couple clay vases. Does that suggest status?
maybe other standards. And I mean, it depends like what resources they had. Like, if people were generally very poor, maybe that was actually valuable. You know, that's when they didn't have those.
Well, so that's a reasonable point. That status is relative. Status is actually relative. So you can't necessarily say, based on what was available and important to people 100 years later, this person didn't have status. I mean, you only have to think about what people had in their houses 100 years ago today, and think, well, we would say nobody has status, except for just a few people. But it's not exactly like that. It's true that you have to compare like with like. So let me give you some information that's relative to that. Relevant, not relative. And that information is that other Middle Helladic 3 cyst graves, other Middle Helladic 3 burials are all like that. They're single cyst inhumations with a few clay pots. End of story.
But aren't there only so many people buried in the grave circles?
Ah. So the fact that it's inside the grave circle suggests status in and of itself. An excellent point, which would lead us then to want to know, this is just like George Washington's fan. Every time you think something, then you have another question. Don't you love archaeology? I love archaeology. Oh, it's so cool. Okay, so the answer to that question is, well, it turns out that outside the environs of the circle itself, both B and A are other burials, and that the walls of the circles are later than the burials. So at some later point, the circles were accorded importance by being made into circles. But before that, they were just graves. They were graves that were part of a much wider, larger cemetery that was used over a long period of time, several hundreds of years. And the earliest of the burials are these Middle Helladic cyst graves, and they're all the same.
With the fact that Grave Circle A is inside the city, does the stonework in the city date to the same stonework as the graves?
At the time that Grave Circle, at the time that the shaft graves of Grave Circle A were excavated out by those Mycenaeans who used them for burial places, there were no walls. There was nothing on top of the citadel that we have any evidence for. There is a much larger Middle Helladic and Late Helladic one, that is middle of the second millennium, cemetery along the slopes of that citadel. And Grave Circle A, like Grave Circle B, the circle is later.
So then, does graves and Grave Circle create the building of the citadel around it, or?
Yes. No, but the graves predate, not the circle that identified it. Sir?
I have a question. Were
Nice question. Excellent question. Were the artifacts in Grave Circle B, did they have that wide source range? And the answer is no. There are some exotic, meaning not from here, from someplace else, objects like the rock crystal duck bowl, which came from Egypt, certainly. The little amethyst seal stone. Amethyst comes from Russia, modern-day Russia. It's unlikely that the thing was carved up there. It's more likely that a little block of amethyst was procured somehow or another. So there are, and there's gold, which comes from the Danube area, considerably north of mainland Greece. So there's some, it's not as widespread, and the quantities are vastly, vastly lower.
So could we infer then that because there was a rewinding?
Yeah, I was.
Okay. You infer then that taking a step from that, there was either an increase in trade or an increase in mobility because they were able to get materials from further away over the course of the two shaft periods?
Okay, so one hypothesis is there was an increase in trade. If you want to know if that is a legitimate hypothesis, what other information you would want to know, you would want to know if any objects that could definitely be seen as coming from Mycenae itself or from mainland Greece are found elsewhere, and especially in any of the other places that this material comes from. And for that, you will want to read in the Aegean Bronze Age website the lesson on Mycenaean trade.
Didn't they say that like they may have exported tin or something?
It's possible. Tin is not a material that is local to here. Tin is something that is acquired from Cyprus, and it's an element necessary to make bronze. Copper and tin are the two things that you need to make bronze, and neither one of them are local to here. So that means that all of the bronze here might have been made here, but the elements to make it would have had to come from someplace else.
Because we don't have any like towns or housing, how many cities or towns are very
Well, this is one place, and as we'll see next Tuesday, a city is going to be built on the top of the citadel, and that city is the city that all of this is connected to. And the fact that there were on the slopes of the citadel burials over a couple of hundred years tells us almost certainly that people were living on the citadel, but not in such a way that their remains were impressive enough, strong enough, that they remained viable. That is, all of the building effort of these people went to the graves, not to the places they lived in. And what's the difference between that? That's the exact opposite of what we have at Troy, where all the effort is in the city and not in the graves. A grave is for an individual or a family. A city, a fortified city, is for a society. One represents individuals, the other institutions. Here we have increasingly wealthy, increasingly stratified society of individuals. We do not yet have institutions, or anyway, we don't have any evidence of them. In the Iliad, there are a lot of kings. The most detailed list of the kings comes in Book 2 of the Iliad in a long, long list called the Catalogue of Ships. The Catalogue of Ships details the number of ships and men and support that each of the kings brought with them to fight for the return of Helen. In the catalog of ships, the cities are specifically listed. Some are more important. I mean, some brought more ships, some brought fewer. In our interest in locating the possible real antagonists of the Trojans in the Trojan War, it's not enough to have one place on the Greek mainland. You need many places, something that is the physical, real equivalent to the catalog of ships. The map that you're looking at shows every place that is identified as a spot from which a warrior from Greece came to fight at Troy. One of them, in fact, the king second most powerful, that is with the second greatest number of ships to those of Agamemnon himself, Agamemnon from Mycenae, was Priam, who came from this region of southern Greece. And am I looking at the right thing? I'm looking on all the way inside. Yeah, from this region of southern Greece, and he comes from a city called Pylos, and his name is Nestor. Pylos is a little town in southern Greece today with a cute little harbor. I took this picture thinking, well, one day I'm going to, back in the 1980s when I lived in Greece for a couple of years, when I was working my dissertation, and I always used to think, well, one day I'm going to be teaching this stuff, and I'm going to talk about Priam and the catalog of ships, and here are all these boats in the harbor at Pylos. Isn't that cute? And so every year I take that picture and think, boy, looks nice there. We should all go. In the environs of the landscape near Pylos are a number of objects or constructions like this one that you see the top of here in the distance. It's a tomb. There were no shaft graves found at Pylos. In fact, shaft graves are rare elsewhere on the Greek mainland. All those other sites that I just showed you, no shaft graves. There are 3 other sites on the Greek mainland where there have been a couple shaft graves found. And that's it. No grave circles, nothing close to the size, the number, the wealth, the objects, nothing else like this. Every place else, the sort of tombs that show up towards the end of the Middle Helladic and the beginning of the Late Helladic, right around the middle of the 2nd millennium, are tombs like this. They are built up stone. They're round, and because they're round, they're called after the Greek word for a round thing, which is a tholos, Tholos. A tholos tomb is a built round structure. It means a built round structure. So the grave circles are not tholoi, because those are just like marked out circles. A tholos has to be something constructed. A round constructed thing. You see this round constructed thing, and it's constructed out of field stones, and it's relatively small, and it sticks up out of the landscape. There it is before Reconstruction, and there it is after Reconstruction. Has a wide open door and a kind of beehive stone top. There are lots and lots of Tholos tombs like this in the area around Pylos, which I'm sorry to tell you, the name of this region in Greece, and you should write this down, is Mycenae, which I know sounds like Mycenae, but it's not. Mycenae is Messenia, and it's this whole zone of southwestern Greece. I specify that because in the reading that you have on Tholos tombs, there's a lot of talk about Mycenae, which is this region around Pylos. All right. What am I about to tell you? Oh, okay. Where did the idea for these built-up round constructions come from? Almost certainly from Crete. which was also the home of one of the Homeric heroes, Idumeus. And on the island of Crete, there are practically identical such tholoi, built up right out of fieldstones with the base built right onto the bedrock itself, and then built straight up, little doorway, and you get a sense of the sort of homey, cozy size from these shots of some people inside a Tholos tomb at Forney, Crete. Tholos tombs on Crete were the locus, the place in which an entire settlement's burials took place. They were the cemetery itself. The burials took place inside these Tholos tombs, and there were just one or two per settlement. Everybody in the settlement was buried. So this is a nice illustration of the point that you were making about status. Status is relative. That's a really important point. So here, because this is what everybody was buried in, this can't likely be a mark of status, because the entire point of status is differentiation. If everybody is the same, that's lovely, and it's not status. Might make for a much nicer society, or group of friends, but it's the opposite of hierarchical. So these Tholos tombs on Crete are the contemporary equivalent of the Middle Helladic cyst graves. These are burials, these are chambers for the burials of an entire settlement, at the same time that in most parts of Greece, including Mycenae, people were buried in individual cyst graves. And right around the middle of the second millennium, almost identical tholoi start to pop up on the Greek mainland, but not in anything like the number and distribution that they show up in Crete. Instead, there are fewer of them. So at any individual settlement, there are more burials than there are tholoi. Tholoi are differentiated from the place where a lot of burials occur. Burials do occur inside Tholoi on Greece, but not all of the settlement's people were buried inside the Tholos. So whereas in Crete, these are obviously where everybody gets buried, when the idea is moved over to the Greek mainland, this built structure itself becomes a mark of status. Here's something that is spookily interesting about Tholoi. In a lot of the places where, according to the Homeric text, heroes came to fight at Troy, such as, for example, out of the way places that were never important later for any reason whatsoever. They were just a place that people lived. They were like, I don't know, the Topeka, Kansas of Greece. A place. Fine. You can be from Topeka. Is anybody here from Topeka? I always try to pick on some place that I won't offend anybody here. So, like, for example, Orchomenos up here in Greek Thessaly is the Topeka, Kansas of Greece. You can be from Orchomenos. Nothing important ever happened there. But there is an enormous Tholos, suggesting that while there might not be anything important about Orchomenos in later times, something important, or somebody important, lived there in the Mycenaean era. The Tholos tombs that show up almost everywhere on the Greek mainland, beginning in LH1, so right after the middle of the second millennium, are different in significant ways than the Tholoi from Crete. They are below ground, not above ground. They are built out of huge, carefully finished stones. They are much larger, as you can see from this group of people standing inside the doorway of this Tholos tomb at Orchomenos. And here's how they were constructed. Part of the hillside was hollowed out, and in the hollow of the hillside, ashlar stone walls were built up to hold back the earth. And more or less at ground level, a particularly enormous stone was shoved into place. These stones are about 100 tons, the stones that cover the doorway into the Tholos. And then a stone dome was constructed over it, and then it was mounded with earth. So, unlike the Cretan Tholoi, which were these little sticky-uppy, out-of-the-ground stone beehive things, Mycenaean Tholoi were much larger and more elaborate and partially buried. Out of all the places where we have Tholoi in spots that, I know that I have one other thing to tell you. Tholoi have one other constituent part. We're going to look at the Tholos from this area right here near Sparta. And the town is Bethel. You see here the great circle, and so in addition to having the large circular chamber that was built up with stone and the massive doorway, the third element of a Tholos tomb is a long entrance course that sloped downward. So here's the beginning of this long entryway into the Bethel Tholos, and you go down, until you actually enter. So you have to imagine that all of this was covered up, and what you would have done is descended down into the Tholos. Now the Tholos is not a tomb per se. Tholos is the marker for a tomb. The burials were inside. They were multiple in the sense that there were many, not just one burial inside. And many of them were relatively modest. That is, they were cyst graves. They could be single inhumations. Some of them could be cremations. You have an article about the excavation of more or less intact, although robbed in antiquity, Mycenaean Tholos, the one in Corinth, in your course pack. Because, however, they were sticky up, sufficiently noticeable that for all the thousands of years that they've been there, people have known where they were. They weren't hidden the way the shaft graves were. Almost all of them have been robbed. So we would like to know a lot more about the sort of grave gifts that were inside them. We don't. The Bethel Tholos, remarkably, it had been robbed in antiquity, but the robbers had been not as thorough or didn't have as much time on their hands as some of the robbers of other Tholoi, and so some cool stuff was found, letting us know that it wasn't just the construction of the Tholos itself, but also that there were cool finds. So here is a beautiful signet stone that shows a griffin and a lady, and these two incredible gold cups with both of which carry an elaborate scene. And I will start with these next week very quickly, and we'll finish up Tholoi, and finally get to where the Mycenaeans lived.